Hey everyone, 2BrainCell here, and I'm back with my final video on TFT fundamentals. We've gone over a lot of the fundamental concepts for TFT, at least for this set, and I think it's time to put it all together. And in order to do that, I thought I would bring back the random number generator, and we could go through an entire game with 12 completely random item components, and I can give you some options for different compositions that you can play at each point in the game, what you should be looking for, and how you want to transition your comp into the late game, especially, and we can go over options based on how your early game is going, what your HP situation is like, and everything. So for this format, I'm going to be using the random number generator 3 times to give me 9 random components, and I'm going to give myself 3 choices of items. So this will simulate the random items that you get from creeps, as well as the choice of items that you get from Carousel. Now obviously I know this is not a completely realistic simulation, because sometimes you won't get the item you want from Carousel, but this is just my version of a simulation. So let's get right into it. The first set of items we're going to have is 372. That is bow, cloak, and chain. With this sort of early item setup, my first instinct is to slime Hurricane. And Hurricane obviously has some mild issues in the sense that it limits your flexibility for endgame comps by almost completely eliminating Kale comps as well as mages from the board. But in terms of the other comps that you can go for, Hurricane is actually a very versatile item. You could definitely run it on either Olaf or Tryndamere in a Slayer's comp, as well as Shyvana in some sort of Brawlers or Dragon Soul centric composition. It's also not a terrible item on Talon, even though it's not best in slot, and it's definitely usable in that sense. So in the early game, if you have this sort of item setup, let's talk about some early item holders for this Hurricane. Now obviously one of the best item holders and one of the best units in the game right now is early Tristana Chosen. Early Tristana Chosen, or Tristana 2 in general, just holds a majority of AP and AD items very well, and has a very, very strong early game setup with Braum and Brand. So if you're able to get an early Tristana 2 with this sort of board setup, as well as being able to slot in sharpshooters in some way, shape, or form, this early level 4 with the Hurricane on the Tristana is extremely, extremely strong. And from this angle, you should have a very solid early game. However, if you're not able to get this sort of early board setup, one other good item holder for Hurricane is actually Wukong Chosen. And even though Wukong Chosen doesn't scale very well, and you're most likely going to have to sell it in at 3-2 level 6, or if you're lucky at level 7, it's still a very good early item holder, especially if you get early Divine and Vanguards in. So with this sort of item setup, depending on which Chosen trait that you get, Wukong Chosen, if it's a Vanguard, you could definitely slot in early 4 Divine. If you're able to get an early Aurelia, and then this is an extremely strong early item setup if you have the Vanguard. If you have the Divine Chosen, obviously feel free to take out the Aurelia, and it's actually a little bit more flexible because you can slot in any early Vanguard, including Garen, in order to get a pretty solid early item setup. Now, obviously, this board has a lot of limitations in the sense that it's an all frontline composition, and getting access to the backline is very difficult. So basically, you have to bank on the fact that your team is or out tanks the enemy frontline, and the Hurricane bolts are able to access the backline in some way, shape, or form. But these are 2 very good early item setups. One final early item setup with this is if you somehow get an early Shyvana. So if you get an early Shyvana, Shyvana is one of the best item holders for Hurricane, and can be a late game carry when she has Hurricane as well. And so with Shyvana, obviously you want to be looking for that premium 4 brawler buff. And so if you do get a brawler chosen, then this is one of the strongest early boards in the game. And at level 5, you can also slot in Dragon Soul, and this becomes an instant, fast 7 without having to roll at level 6, and it's an extremely strong board. The item that I would go for in the early Carousel, which is my choice of items, would definitely be Sword. And the reason why Sword is the clear candidate or the clear choice is because it allows you to slam GA, which is one of the best items in the game right now. It's very flexible, can be used on the majority of endgame carries, and in this particular setup, it synergizes really well with the majority of Hurricane users. So in Slayer's compositions, Olaf and Tryndamere both really like having GA, and I would argue that it's actually a best in slot item for both of those units. And even within the majority of Shyvana builds, having a GA is definitely not bad, though it's less necessary given Shyvana's tankiness with the Brawler synergy. Finally, if you are forced to play Talon from this spot with the Hurricane, GA is also a best in slot item on Talon because of his ability, or because of his susceptibility to getting blown up in certain situations, and having the GA allows a lot more survivability for the Talon. So let's move on to the next set of items. So with this next set of items, Chain, Glove, and Sword, you actually have some choices that you can make here. One option is to slam the Infinity Edge, which is a very good item on both Tryndamere and Olaf, as well as a best in slot item on Talon. So that gives you all three of those options. It's not quite as good of an item on the Shyvana, just because she doesn't really utilize crit all that well within her build. Another consideration is that you could slam a second GA, which is very good for Slayers builds in particular, because Slayers are often at their best if they're running two carries, so Olaf plus Tryndamere or Olaf plus Samira, and both and the secondary carry having a GA adds a lot to the damage uptime. And if you do go the option of slamming a second GA, it allows you to save the glove for something like a Last Whisper, which is an extremely high value item right now within both Slayers builds, within Talon builds, and it's not a terrible item within a Shyvana build either, just because of the prevalence of people running Vanguards as a frontline, especially with Aatrox and Sejuani being the premier frontline units in the game. So in this sort of situation, let's first look back at the Tristana build that we had started with early. So with that Tristana build, we had been running a early Dragon Soul setup with Sharpshooters and Dragon Soul, as well as the Braum. And let's say we have the Hurricane and the GA already slammed. And so in this situation, you could definitely think about slamming the IE, and it wouldn't be bad at all to just put it on the Tristana. However, I would say if you are in a better HP situation, there's no real need to force the items that hard. And your level 5 and level 6 transitions, especially with this board, should be quite strong. So one example transition is to definitely slot in the Spirits at level 5, and then put in some sort of Vanguard at level 6. And so with this sort of board, without even having a Chosen, you already have a lot of really good synergies that work well together, and allow for your main carry, Tristana, to get off a lot of DPS. And Braum, as one of the best units in the game right now, with his ability to just tank forever in the early and mid game, does have a really good time here. And so if you're able to greed your items a little bit, and let's say you slam a GA on the Teemo, it's not a terrible slam. It doesn't have as much value as you would want it to, but it does allow for Teemo to maybe get a second or third cast off during the fight. And in this sort of situation, you can then save your glove for something like a Last Whisper. The same sort of item choice becomes a little bit more awkward when you look at some of the other boards that we were running earlier. So if we take a look at something like a Wukong, like the Wukong board that we were looking at, which was reliant on Wukong Chosen as the main carry with Hurricane and GA, there's actually not a lot of other users for something like a GA in this sort of situation. Jax is not the best GA holder, and Garen and Nasus are really just in there as synergy bots. And so in this sort of situation, you do have the option to put in 2 more Vanguards to give you 4 Vanguards and give your Wukong a little more tankiness. But especially with the item setup, where it's difficult to slam any sort of item unless you want to commit to slamming IE here. Another possibility is to just put in a solid backline, which alleviates one of the weaknesses that we were talking about this composition earlier, which is a lack of backline damage and backline access. So putting something like a Callista in here is extremely strong, because not only does it synergize well with Duelists, but it actually gives you another holder for GA. And in this sort of situation, you can also put something like a Vladimir in, which just gives you the added bonus trait of a Siphoner. Right, and so this is something around the level 6 setup that you would want to run with this board. Obviously, this is not an amazing setup, but it's one that does work. And again, alternatively, you could not slam the GA and not greed your glove, and instead slam an IE on Wukong. And then from this spot, you're a little bit more limited in terms of your build. I definitely think you can still run Olaf Tryndamere and Talon, but it kind of eliminates the possibility of you running something like a Shyvana Dragon Souls build, just because Shyvana doesn't really use IE as an item very well. And finally, if we're looking at the Shyvana build from earlier, IE is also not a great slam, and you also struggle to find another holder for GA, and so within the same vein, you probably would just want to GA one of your backline units. So for example, if you had a brawler chosen in this spot, and you're running the same board with Brandon Tristana, you could just think about GAing your Tristana with the initial GA and Hurricane on the Shyvana, right? And then this gives you just a little bit more survivability, and maybe your Tristana, especially if it's 2-starred, gets one more Dragon Soul proc off if the whole rest of the team dies. And so this is a very solid board setup. Alternatively, if you do get 6 brawlers and aren't able to run Dragon Soul because you prioritize the 6 brawler synergy over it, you could definitely just run the Tristana as a standalone unit, which obviously isn't great, but it serves as a bridge unit until you get to level 7 and you can put the brand back in, right? And Tristana still does non-negligible damage even if she doesn't really have too many synergies going for her. One final alternative for this build is to just put something like a Lulu in for the Elderwood buff. I would only do this if you have a 2-star version of either Maokai or Nunu, just because I don't think the Elderwood trait would be all that valuable without one of those units being strong. And then finally, let's look at a scenario where your early game did not go well, and you're at low HP with these items, and you're forced to roll on level 6. Well, one of the best holders for the items that you got is if you get something like a Callista Chosen, right? And so with a Callista Chosen setup, especially if it's cultist, you want to try to find hopefully 6, but at least 3 cultists within this sort of setup. So obviously you want duelists in to maximize your damage output. And let's just look at a build where you get a 3 cultist setup. Let's say just with the Callista and the Sivir to give you extra attack speed. Then you can round out the rest of your comp with maybe a Divine unit, Divine and Vanguards, something along those lines, so that you have a solid front line in front of the Callista and allows her to do damage. Within this 4-core setup, you can think about either adding 2 duelists to give you a 4 duelist synergy, which is a very strong setup at level 6. And then alternatively, you can think about maybe putting in Nasus instead of Wukong, getting the Siphoner trait, and then adding a little bit of star value to your cultists, and finally rounding out the composition just with something that provides CC, maybe like a Jarvan. And in this sort of scenario, obviously this is not an ideal setup, right? You might not get the best number of synergies that you want, but this sort of board, especially if it's 2-starred, with these sort of items on the Callista and maybe a nice item on the Sivir like the GA, you're probably going to be able to win out stage 3 and maybe even early stage 4 if you get some upgrades during your level 7 roll down. So let's with that in mind, let's move on to the next set of items. Before that though, let's first talk about our item choice in Carousel, because I forgot about that. So with all the talk that I had earlier about trying to get a Last Whisper and saving your glove for that purpose, the item you definitely want to go for in Carousel here is a bow. And again, I'll reiterate that Last Whisper is one of the best items in the game right now because of its high value against the two premium frontline units right now in Sejuani and Aatrox. And having a Last Whisper not only allows you to kill them faster, but it probably allows you to prevent them from casting for a second rotation, which is one of the biggest benefits because of how impactful both of their CC abilities are. And so in this sort of situation, once you get the bow, I would definitely put the Last Whisper on something like the Callista, and within our previous sports, definitely on the main carries that we are looking at, either Tristana or Wukong or Shyvana in that case, if you decide that you don't want to go for Shyvana Chosen as an endgame build. If you are thinking about going for Shyvana as an endgame carry, then the item you want to go for is actually Hodge over Last Whisper, just because Shyvana doesn't actually need the armor shred, because a lot of her damage is magic damage from her ult, and going for the Hodge gives her either extra damage from her ult or some much needed sustain. So with this final set of items, bow, rod, and belt, all of our previous options that we had discussed, either variation of the Slayers, Olaf or Tryndamere, the Talon build opens up now even more because of a insta Morello that you can slam onto Morganas that you get. And the Shyvana build, even though it doesn't have a great Morello user, does utilize Cho'Gath, who is a pretty decent Morello user. And so with these new set of items, it doesn't detract from any of the compositions that we had talked about previously, but what it does do is open up a new composition that we could potentially run, which is the Kennen Keepers composition. So because of the Morello that we were able to get in this third round, and the two GAs that we picked up earlier on, running a Morello Kennen composition is extremely strong, especially if your early game hasn't been going well and you need to roll at level 7. So let's first look at what the Kennen Morello composition looks like. So with the Kennen Morello composition, the main carry of the build is definitely Kennen with both a Morello as well as a Guardian Angel. I would say that these are the two best in slot items on Kennen. And to surround him, you want as many keepers as possible. And so hopefully, during your level 7 roll down, if you're forced to do something like that, you're able to get something like a Keeper Kennen Chosen. And with a Keeper Kennen Chosen, you can easily slot in 6 keepers with a 5 unit setup that looks something like this. You would generally want to frontline your Xayah, because Xayah actually acts as a secondary carry in this composition, especially with the items that you already have. And so she can utilize the Hurricane to somewhat of an extent, the Last Whisper pretty well, and is a very good user of GA, right? And so this allows you to make the most out of some of the Slayer-oriented items that you had gotten earlier while transitioning into a completely new build. Right, and so with this 5 unit setup, what you definitely want to add on to it is an Aatrox. Now it might be difficult to get an Aatrox at level 7, so you might have to make do without. But Aatrox is one of the core components core components of this build, because Aatrox pulls backline carries like Aurelion Sol, Kayle into Kennen ulti, which which alleviates the one big weakness of this build, which is sometimes backline access, and having premier 4-cost carries outrange your entire team, right? And so with this 6 unit setup, the best thing that you want to slot in at this point is probably something like a Kindred, right? And so adding a Kindred in here gives you a little bit more damage on your Xayah, just a little bit more damage in general, and a little bit more single target threat, because your composition right now is very AoE heavy. If your game has been going well, however, and you can utilize a solid 4-cost carry, then there's no need to roll down 7 for this sort of composition. So in this sort of situation, you have the luxury of being able to just go with whatever you hit, right? And so if you hit a Tryndamere Chosen, run Tryndamere as the carry. If you hit a Olaf Chosen, run Olaf as a carry. And if you hit a Talon Chosen, run Talon as a carry. If you hit a Morgana chosen, run Morgana and Talon as the carries, right? And so we'll go through each of them very briefly. And so in this sort of situation, you definitely don't mind slamming the Morello because regardless of which composition you go, let's just say you run some sort of Slayer's variation, Sejuani is actually a very good user of Morello as an item, and this is what makes Morello one of the more slammable items right now, because a lot of endgame compositions do have units that utilize Morello very well. And so the endgame Slayer's composition, regardless of whether you're running Olaf or Tryndamere, looks something like this, with Sejuani Aatrox, as well as Tryndamere and one final Slayer. Oftentimes it's Pike until you can get Samira, right? And so this is your 5-unit core, and you can add different components in based on what you get. And so if you're running an Olaf carry, whether it's a chosen or not, you definitely want to try to get Dragon Soul in there somehow, right? And so Dragon Soul is most easily utilized by slotting in the Brahma and the Aurelian Soul. And then in this sort of situation where you're running 7 units, you can easily just put in one more Vanguard, right? And so let's just put a Garen in for now. It's obviously not the most amazing unit, but up until the point you get Ornn, it's relatively negligible which Vanguard you utilize in this sort of situation. And so if we're running Sejuani as our Morello holder, we want to, and Olaf as our main carry, we want to give the majority of the damage items to Olaf. And so this is more than good Olaf setup, one of the strongest in fact. And then you can utilize Tryndamere as the second Guardian Angel holder in this sort of situations. And obviously if you can run this exact same setup if you have Tryndamere as your main carry by just transferring the Hurricane and the Last Whisper to Tryndamere, by dropping the Aurelian Soul and just putting in a duelist, something like a Callista, which also has the added benefit of giving you cultists in this sort of situation. And then finally, let's take a look really quickly at the Talon build, which is a very big deviation from the current build we have on the board. And so if you hit something like a Morgana chosen or a Talon chosen, this could be definitely a very good composition to go for. And so Morgana is obviously one of the premier carries of this composition, especially with Morello. And the build is generally centered around this sort of set with these 3 units. And you want to fill out the rest of the board with Aurelia, with Shen, which gives you Mystic plus Adept. The best Mystic to add in this case is Janna, because it gives you more enlightened units. And then you obviously want to keep the Pike in here for extra utility. And depending on which chosen you get, the last 2 units could vary significantly. And so generally I don't think running 6 enlightened is all that necessary. And so in this sort of situation, what you ideally want is, of course, Siphoner. Nasus is one of the best because it gives your Aurelia a Divine, as well as provides Siphoner to the whole team. And if you somehow get a Siphoner chosen, then something like a Vladimir or a Swain, if you're able to get it, is extremely strong. And this is a very, very strong endgame board. Finally, with the bow that we have left over after slamming all of our other items, you have a few item choices that you can make based on which composition you're running. So with the current composition we have on the board, if you have a magnetic remover, or if you're just able to greed and not put the Hurricane on the Talon, then going for something like Sword is really strong because it allows you to make Giant Slayer. And the reason why Giant Slayer is so good on Talon is because one of Talon's weaknesses is getting stuck on a very tanky unit and not resetting on the rest of the enemy team. And so with the combination of Giant Slayer and Last Whisper, Talon no longer really has that weakness, because regardless of whether your enemy is running a Vanguard's frontline or a Brawler's frontline, Talon, especially in conjunction with Morgana's damage, is able to get a lot of free reset with this particular item build. Giant Slayer is also a really good item on either of the Slayer variations, and more specifically, I think on the Tryndamere carry variation, because in the Olaf carry variation, you get Dragon Soul, which is a percentage health magic damage, and it sort of alleviates the need to do health-based damage. But when you're running a Tryndamere carry comp against a very like an 8 brawler composition, it sometimes feels like it's difficult to kill anything because of how tanky and how much health everything has, which can be alleviated by including Giant Slayer in your build. An alternative is if not too many people are running brawlers, if you go for a glove and carousel, and this is particularly applicable to Slayer compositions which run multiple carries, with Olaf and Tryndamere and potentially Samira. Going for a second Last Whisper is and running a true 2 carry composition is extremely strong. Tryndamere and Samira both utilize Last Whisper extremely well, and it makes your team's threat a lot more dynamic and not quite as reliant on that one carry unit, which if it dies early on the fight, then you kind of auto lose the fight. Finally, if you're running the Keeper Kennen build, then going for a tier might actually be your best bet. Static Shiv is a really good item on both Xayah and Kindred because it synergizes with Executioner because they have a higher crit chance on lower health targets, and because the magic resist shred really benefits Kennen during a lot of these fights, because the way that the Keeper Kennen build wants to work is really just one shot the majority of the board before they have a chance to really do anything. So this has been my final video on TFT fundamentals. I hope you enjoyed the series, and thank you all for watching, and hopefully I'll be back soon with more educational content.